Dear Lord, I pray that you would use these words that you've given me this morning to speak to us about your incredible grace. Amen.
Amen.
As the Apostle Paul tells us, creation reveals God's invisible qualities. So, as we look around today, where do we see his grace? Can his mercy and love clearly be seen as Romans 1 claims? If we're being honest, these trying times we're facing right now may often cloud our view of God and make it difficult to see any good at all. Some may look at the laws of creation and conclude that God is actually merciless and unforgiving. For example, if you trip and fall, gravity is never going to pause because it loves you. Hurricanes don't care who you are, they're still going to destroy your town. And COVID-19 doesn't care what kind of life you've lived, it will still ravage your body. To quote Charles Spurgeon, laws of nature move on immutably like the great wheels of a mighty machine, and he that is entangled in those wheels is ground to powder. It does seem as if we had slight evidence of the mercy of God if we look to nature alone. Certainly not enough to calm the conscience or allay the fears of the guilty. Many are pummeled by the harsh realities of living in this world and perceive that if there is a God, there's no way that he could possibly be merciful or loving, that his grace, if he has any, is insufficient. But in order to perceive that God's grace isn't good enough, we would have to overlook one very important detail, and that is, we're still here. Despite the laws of nature that are so relentlessly unforgiving, we have survived for millennia, and it would be foolish to think that it was all our own doing. One thing that separates a person with faith from one who lacks it is seeing that there is goodness in the world. And that goodness comes from a God who loves us, whose grace alone sustains us. Once we see that there is a good God who's on our side, we can harness the power he gives us to share that goodness with the world. One group notorious for their inability to see God's goodness was the wilderness wandering Israelites spoken about in Nehemiah and Psalms today. This is a group of people who experienced God's grace in arguably the most plain and clear ways possible. They experienced possibly the most intimate and astonishing works of God throughout all history. These Israelites stood absolutely no chance of attaining freedom from Pharaoh's captivity on their own, but God bent the laws of nature to miraculously free them. This is also a group who would have faced certain starvation in the desert had God not miraculously provided bread from heaven and water from rocks to sustain them. God also escorted them personally via a pillar of fire and cloud to the good land that he had promised them and told them, "It's yours, take it." But instead of praising God, we hear complaint after complaint over and over again. 14 complaints in Exodus in all. They complain about the food God provides, then about Moses' leadership, then how intimidating the giants are in the promised land. They eventually outright rebel against Moses, and even after they suffer consequences of their griping, they go on griping even more. Meanwhile, God was seeing to it that every one of their needs were met, down to making sure their clothes didn't wear out and that their feet didn't swell over the course of trekking through the desert for 40 years. Nehemiah 9:16 reads, "They were not mindful, or they failed to remember the wonders that you performed among them." It's no wonder Israel is often referred to as stiff-necked, a Hebraic term used to describe unruly and obstinate oxen who are difficult to lead because they won't turn their necks. Where did Israel's sense of entitlement come from? Their actions and attitude shows that they felt they deserved better than God's efforts. It seems like they believed the same lie that the serpent told Eve back in the garden in Genesis 3. The lie that God isn't to be trusted. He's holding us back from partaking in what we rightfully deserve. We can have the same attitude as the Israelites at times, and Lord knows I have a real problem with this when I'm at work as a waitress. Anyone who has worked in a customer service setting can probably attest that there are some really difficult people out there that really test your patience. I've been working on not saying my complaints out loud to my coworkers as much anymore because, as we've seen, complaints are toxic and contagious. But they still keep creeping into my thoughts. And when I'm dwelling on the negative, it's impossible for me to remember and be mindful of what the Lord has done and is doing and be grateful. We all complain or host pity parties for ourselves, or we start allowing ourselves to believe that the grass is greener somewhere else. And when we do this, it opposes our faith. We're painting God as the bad guy because he's holding out on what we deserve. But despite our lapses or failures in faith, God is always good. Nehemiah verse 16 continues, "But you are God, ready to forgive, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and did not forsake them." God's goodness towards us far outweighs any of our resentment, rebellion, and lack of appreciation towards him. He's a good father. He doesn't need our appreciation or reciprocation to continue providing for us, protecting us, sustaining us. God doesn't need anything for that matter. If anything, all we do is need and take. All he does is supply and give. When we're selfish, he remains selfless. This is the definition of grace. In the gospel reading for today, we see an incredible account of God's grace in Matthew chapter 14. It starts out with Jesus just trying to have some alone time. He withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place, says verse 13. We don't really know why, but we can take a few guesses. Jesus had just heard about John's beheading, a completely unjust situation that he could have been righteously angry about. Maybe Jesus was mourning the loss of his cousin and the prophet who prepared the way for his ministry. Jesus also must have been contemplating his own fate, which he knew would be much worse than John's. And we know from Mark 6 that Matthew had John's murderer, we know from Mark 6 and Matthew 14 that John's murderer, Herod, thought Jesus was John reincarnated. So Jesus could have possibly been dodging a dangerous situation. And lastly, Jesus had also just come from many towns who would not receive his message and outright rejected him. After all this, no one would blame Jesus for needing some time alone to pray, rest, recharge. But 5,000 men and their families decide that this is the perfect opportunity to go meet up with him. Jesus doesn't even get a chance to land his boat before the crowd greets him on the shore. Think about how you might feel if you were completely spent and retreated to have some alone time to recuperate. You probably wouldn't be exactly happy to see a whole town's worth of people interrupt you, expecting help. If it were me, and probably any normal human being, I wouldn't have a single drop left in my care cup for these people. I might even turn my boat right around like, oops, wrong shore. Or if I did choose to help these people, I would probably just be going through the motions like a robot. But what is Jesus' response to this crowd? He has compassion on them. He heals their sick. Even without time alone to pray and rest, Jesus' care cup is full, even overflowing. He's not a normal human being at all. He's God. His love does not dry up or run out. His service is so much more than going through the motions. He goes above and beyond what is expected by performing this incredible miracle of multiplying the loaves and fishes to feed this crowd. The disciples were right that they easily could have sent the people away to nearby towns for food. But Jesus wanted to take this incredible opportunity to not just provide them with a free meal, but to teach them about God's incredible grace. The bread that they eat is not just sustenance for their bodies, but Jesus goes on to tell him that he is the bread of life, who sustains their spirit, who provides them everlasting life. And we read about that in John's account in John 6. In looking to heaven to thank the Father for this provision, Jesus is giving the multitude an example of what we need to do, which is remember that God the Father is the one who sustains and provides life. The 12 basketfuls of bread left over, one for each tribe of Israel, are a tangible representation of God's abundance of steadfast love for all. The last thing I'd like to highlight before I close is Jesus' use of the disciples to make this miracle happen. They were no doubt worn out and discouraged as well, but their faith and obedience to Jesus was the vehicle by which this meal was shared. We too need only rely on the fullness, the abundance of Jesus' love, not on our own, to bring his goodness to those around us. To quote Paul from 2 Corinthians 12, "But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you. My power is perfected in weakness.' That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." As we depart from this meeting today, we're going out into a world that's full of negativity. There are harsh realities that we'll face, and contagious bad attitudes that will try to pit us against God. Let's not be blind to God's grace or tell him that he's not good enough. When complaints, self-pity, and entitlement rear their ugly head, we need to be mindful to remember the good that can be clearly seen all around us. When we're weary and empty, let's lean on the fullness of God that is ready to fill us up at a moment's notice. We can't produce any good on our own, but we can be satisfied with the amazing grace that freely flows out from above. Let's embrace the power that God gives us to share that grace with those he calls us to. Amen.
Amen.